Christians through the ages have disagreed about interpretations of Scripture. That's why we have so many different denominations, is because Christians are trying to follow what they read in the Scripture. So when we come to Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 about homosexuality, it should not surprise us that faithful Christians disagree about these passages. On the more progressive side of reading towards LGBT inclusion in the church, some things have come up that have been helpful for me as I've thought about it, to realize that this is a reasonable interpretation. Verse 26 says that even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. Typically, this has been taught as the only verse in the Bible that deals with lesbianism. But historically, that was not always the case. The great theologian Augustine in the 5th century wrote about this verse in his book, Marriage and Desire, in 420 AD. And he points out that this is about women having oral or anal sex with men. That's what it meant for them to exchange natural desires for unnatural desires. And he says that that's forbidden in Romans 1. And what's interesting is there's absolute unanimity for the first 400 years of church history that is how this text is to be read. It's not about lesbians. It's about women having oral or anal sex with men. So if you think now the universal reading is, well, it's about lesbian sex, the church has not always thought that. For all of church history, up to the 5th century, that's not how the church thought about it. The church has changed its interpretation of Scripture on this passage before. So let's think a little bit about what's going on in this passage. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. There's so much more that could be discussed, but to keep this short, I want us to think about that word unnatural. That men and women, it's used twice, exchanged natural relations for unnatural relations. Typically, that's used in arguments to say that according to nature, God's created design, these people are sinning because men are having sex with men and women are having sex with women. It's unnatural. But when you look at the text itself and the words there, the word is paraphusis or physis, depending how you translate it or pronounce it. It's 2 Greek words, against nature. Those same words come up in a couple of other crucial passages. One of them that's most similar to Romans chapter 1 is from 1 Corinthians 11. And in 1 Corinthians 11, I'll read it to you. In verse 13, it says this: "Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature," same word, "of things teach that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. And if anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God." Okay. The context is very similar to Romans 1. There's been a debate about creation, and now there's some debate about men and women and their activities. The word nature is used, and Paul says we have no other practice here, no other practice, nor do any of the other churches. This is universal. And yet today, we don't follow that. In very few churches is it taught that women can't have short hair or men can't have long hair. We've changed that. And we've said it was culturally bound. So the word that we would use for natural, it's not natural, is we would say it was unconventional. It's like jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. That's not natural. What I mean is that's unconventional. The second verse that we want to look at, so that's the most similar in some ways to Romans 1, 26 and 27, is that passage in 1 Corinthians 11. But what's really helpful is in the same book, the book of Romans, a few chapters later, Paul uses the exact same phrase, against nature. It's against nature to do this. And this is where it is. In Romans 11:24, he says this: you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature. He's talking to the Gentiles, the Greeks, right? And contrary to nature, you were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, which is, he explains, that's Israel. That they now have the Greeks have been grafted in and now have the promises and the scriptures and all these gifts, right? But notice what Paul is saying here, that it's unnatural to do this. It's unnatural to graft two trees together. And yet, who is it who's doing the grafting? It's God. Read Romans 11. God is doing this miraculous, unnatural thing, which is not against creation. It's not sinful. It's actually glorious. It's just unconventional. And so what Paul is doing here, according to the progressive argument, is that instead of giving a universally binding appeal to creational design, which is natural, in the context, he's referring to a situation that's culturally bound and is unconventional and sinful in that context. And when we think about that context, the context that Paul is writing to in the first century, gay relations were very different than they are now. Okay, there were three main forms of homosexual sexual activity in the first century. The most common by far was pederasty, which is when the adult, educated class free men were having sex with adolescents. Right? This was very common. I'll read to you a little bit from Plato. Okay, this is from his Symposium. And he writes this: this is the love which is of youths. Those who are inspired by this love turn to the male and delight in him, who is the more valiant and intelligent nature than women. They love not boys, so not elementary school kids, but intelligent beings whose reason is beginning to be developed much about the time at which their beards begin to grow. So 13-year-olds. And in choosing young men to be their companions, they mean to be faithful to them and pass their whole life in company with them. So this is a pederastic relationship where an adult male takes on a prepubescent male, right, who's just starting to come to puberty, has a long-term sexual relationship with them as a form of mentorship into Roman society. We would say today, that is not okay. That is wrong. Now add to that the second and third types of sex, which were coerced sex. So sex with slaves and sex with prostitutes. So you think about that temple of Aphrodite had 1,000 male and female prostitutes. You would go to worship, and as part of, you would offer your gift, and then you would have sex with one of the prostitutes as an act of worship to Aphrodite. And your slaves were said to be for your own pleasure. And therefore, if you derive pleasure by having sex with them, you should do so, because that's why slaves exist. This is the first century. Those are the three forms of same-sex sexual activity that you see. That's what you see. You can look it up. There are two. I've only heard two commonly referred to examples of what you might call consensual adult-on-adult same-sex relationships. All right, so I want us to look at those. I don't find either one convincing. The first is between Achilles and Patroclus, okay? And they were a long-term couple, okay? They were in love, they were committed to one another. Right? And if you read the old mythologies, it's a beautiful relationship in so many ways. And yet, Plato records that when that relationship began, Achilles was, quote unquote, a beardless youth and younger by far. So it was still a pederastic relationship. It's just one that turned out, they ended up, as Achilles grew to be an adult, they fell in love. I don't find that convincing as an equivalent for what we have today in consensual, covenantal, mutual gay marriage. The second example that is used is the weddings of the Emperor Nero. And I just think, again, these are the only examples that are out there. So listen to these. So Nero married two men. The first was in 64 AD. He married a free man named Pythagoras. Now, this wedding came at the end of a 3-day orgy where he built this lake in the center of Rome and put this barge on it and brought all these zoo animals and all this stuff to swim in the lake. He emptied the whorehouses and had naked prostitutes line the lake and on the barge. And it was an orgy for 3 days. And at the height of the orgy, in front of everyone, he had a wedding where he had sex with his new bride. Well, that's weird. That does not seem like what we're talking about today in the 21st century. The second wedding was 2 years later, and it was in AD 66 with his slave Sporus. So did Sporus have a choice? No. He said he fell in love with Sporus because he looked like a loved one that Nero had previously killed and regretted killing. And so he had Sporus castrated so that he could play the part of the wife. Okay. Those are the weddings or the adult mutual relationships, same-sex relationships that we see in the first century. I'm not aware of anything else. I've read everything I can find. I don't think they're parallel to what's going on today in the 21st century with gay marriage. So I have to find in Romans 1, sure, I think every sin that is listed in Romans 1 is still a sin today. I just don't think that gay marriage is one of them.